Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist at No Labels. Ryan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
No Labels is a third-party organization, and last week the organization announced it was no longer putting forth a unity ticket for the 2024 presidential election. So to dive into the conversation, can you tell us why you came to that decision?
Sure. Well, look, No Labels has been around for 14 years, and most of that time we actually spent in Congress trying to bring Democrats and Republicans together to work together. It was only 2 years ago that we looked at the presidential election and thought maybe there'd be an opening for a third choice in this election. And so what we focused on was getting on the ballot in states across the country. And we were making great progress on that front. If we had chosen to go all the way, we feel very confident we would have got on the ballot in all the states, but we said we'd never put up a ticket unless we thought it could win. And in the end, we were not able to find a ticket with two candidates that we thought hit that threshold. And so we decided to shut it down, and now we're going to return to a lot of the core work we've been doing in Congress.
Nancy Jacobson, who's No Labels founder and CEO, according to the Wall Street Journal, said that your organization reached out to 30 potential candidates for a possible ticket. What were those conversations like? Did they all say no? What did that look like?
Well, it wasn't 30. It was a lot less than that. I think what people got confused about is we briefed lots of politicians, but not all of them were offered to get on the ticket. But we did talk to a lot of people about potentially being on the ticket. And what we walked them through was what we thought was an unprecedented opening. I mean, the biggest thing that jumped out to us in the polling that we did for 2 years was over and over again, if we asked voters, if it were Trump, Biden, and a moderate independent, would you be open to voting for the independent? Something on the order of 60% over and over again said yes. The reason why to us that was so significant was not that we ever thought an independent would get 60%, but it's that they don't have to get anything close to that to win. So in a multi-candidate race, remember, it's winner take all. So if you get 35, 36% of the vote in the state, you get all the electoral votes that come with it. So you only needed to get a chunk of that open to universe, and we thought there was a path. But there was a lot of reasons why candidates decided it just was not a fit for them. I think chief among them, honestly, was the pressure from the parties. There was a bit of a nuclear response from the respective party establishments to try to shut this down.
Can you dive into that a little bit more? Because when you look at polling, the majority of Americans don't want to see a 2020 rematch. And as we sit here right now, 4 years later, that's exactly what appears to be happening. So why, when you see those numbers, did this not come to fruition?
Well, look, I mean, the parties themselves, I think, have made a very cynical bet, which is they've almost given up on making an affirmative appeal to voters at this point. They just sort of count on, you don't even really need to like our candidate. As long as you hate and fear the other candidate on the other side more, you'll come home to vote for us. And if you look at over the course of the last year or two, both parties in different ways have made it impossible for any competition to emerge within their own parties. So, the Republicans stacked the rules in terms of how they awarded delegates and everything else in ways that helped Trump. The Democrats refused to host any debates or create a path for legitimate primary competition for President Biden. And in fact, right now, the fact that Robert F. Kennedy is in the race as an independent is really a function of the fact that the Democrats really wouldn't let him compete in the primary. So he just decided, all right, if you're not going to let me go in this path, I'm going to try the independent route.
To your point, then, of this being a largely negative campaign, there hasn't been much platforms released aside from the fact of, hey, vote for me, I'm better than that guy. Do you think there's ever going to be some appetite for a unity ticket, maybe 4 years down the road, 8 years down the road?
Look, there's an opening now, right? So I don't think there's any question about that. And if our political system continues to be as dysfunctional as it is now, that appetite is only going to grow. But I will say, look, one of the things we're really concerned about is that if you look forward 7, 8 months from now, there is almost no scenario I think anybody can imagine where we wake up the day after the election and anybody feels okay about it, right? There's going to be half the country that is going to be fearful, outraged, scared, because in different ways, both sides are signaling that if I don't win, the country is dead, right? So President Biden is saying, vote for me, democracy's on the ballot. He's sort of intimating if Trump gets elected, we won't even have an election in 2028. Meanwhile, Trump is saying, this is the final battle. If I don't win, we're going to lose our country. Well, what do you think happens if voters are hearing this day after day, week after week, month after month? They're going to believe it. And so we're very concerned at No Labels that there's going to be nobody there to pick up the pieces when this election is over to try to pull the country back together. That's one of the things we're going to be very focused on.
To your point earlier, you said RFK Jr. obviously now is an independent, running as one for president. Did No Labels ever reach out to him to be on some sort of unity ticket?
We did not. And look, part of that was, No Labels released a common sense policy booklet last year, and we made it very clear that any candidates we'd be reaching out to, we would really expect to subscribe to key elements of that. And Robert F. Kennedy's agenda didn't really match up with that agenda, so we never made any kind of outreach to his campaign.
Both candidates, as you intimated earlier, are painting a really bleak picture if the other candidate wins. What do you think that says about the current state of our political system?
Well, I mean, look at what's happening right now in Congress, where you actually have a bipartisan bill that most people in Congress support. And this is the bill I'm talking about, which would both secure our border, but also get some really critical aid to our allies in Israel, in Ukraine, in Taiwan. If that bill could just get to the floor for a vote in the House, it would pass. It's got enough bipartisan support. But we have a situation where a very narrow band of extremists in the House are preventing a bill from even getting voted on. And you're just sort of seeing this time and time again. We are starting to reach the point where we can't, as a country, even do the basic blocking and tackling of governing. We can't pass a budget on time. We can't solve any of our long-term problems, be it our fiscal situation, our debt. I mean, we are racking up $1 trillion in debt every 100 days. Neither candidate right now has anything to say about it, meaningful. Nobody in Congress is doing anything about it. We all know how bad the border situation is. And unfortunately, what happens in our system today is that over and over again, we have people who decide they would rather campaign on an issue than actually solve it. It's much easier to just demonize the other side and say it's their fault than to actually do the hard work to solve a problem.
Obviously, with the unity ticket, there would be a lot of bipartisanship right on that ticket. So what were the top issues for No Labels in 2024? What did that platform and that policy look like?
Well, I mean, we had this common sense policy booklet I mentioned that we put out that had about 30 ideas in there. And the basis of these were just extensive research that we did over the course of a year to see where the public lands on a lot of key issues. So these were, we thought, 30 ideas that represented, this is where most Americans want to go on most issues. Now, look, in the end, no presidential campaign would have been about 30 things. There are only about 3 or 4 things. I think a couple issues that would have defined a unity ticket, if there was one, was a common sense compromise that both secured our border, but created a humane solution to deal with current immigration system in the country. So finding a solution for the dreamers, finding a way to have a kind of sensible, efficient flow of workers into the country. So that would have been one. 2 would have been the fiscal situation. Again, our budget is the most predictable crisis that we have as a country. We are at a point now where every single year, we now spend more on interest payments on our debt than we do on the entire Defense Department. And that is only going to grow over time. And somebody has to start a conversation on how we're going to deal with that. And then finally, there is a really worrisome strain of isolationism on the foreign policy front that I think you're seeing in both parties, on the left or the right. You see folks on the left who want to abandon Israel, a very strong traditional ally of ours. You see some on the right who want to abandon Ukraine and refuse to provide the help they need to fight the aggression from Russia. I think you would have saw a unity ticket really lean into those issues. But beyond these specific policy issues, I think the biggest difference you would have seen would have been just one of approach. What we are faced with today is every time we have a president who comes in, they assume they have a mandate they don't have. So they'll come in, they'll win a very narrow majority, they'll have a very narrow majority in Congress, and then they will act as if they are Ronald Reagan in 1984 after he won 49 states, or FDR in the 30s when he had the whole Congress. And they come in and they just try to jam things down the throat of the other party. And that creates a really vicious cycle where we never create any kind of durable change in the country. Every time a Democrat or a Republican passes something, the second the ink dries on that bill, the other party gets about trying to undo it. And that's just not a sustainable way to run a country.
When you approached potential candidates to be on the unity ticket, were there any policy non-starters that you saw?
No, I mean, that was one of the biggest things we did not do. Was one of the biggest problems in our politics is the proliferation of litmus tests. And so if you want to run for office as a Democrat or a Republican, there is an ever-growing checklist of things you have to say you are for or you are against. And if you deviate on even one of those, you're basically dead to everybody in the party. So we had this common sense policy agenda that we thought directionally provided a view of where most Americans want to go, and we wanted candidates to subscribe to that. We didn't have any single issue litmus tests.
When you were first looking at putting this ticket together, were you thinking Republican top of the ticket, Democrat running mate, or vice versa?
When we started, we didn't have a specific idea on which would be on top, whether it be an R or a D. As we went along, it did start to become clear in the polling that a Republican on top of the ticket just performed better than one with a Democrat on the top. So as we got to the end of the process, that we were looking more potentially at Republicans to lead the ticket.
Founding chairman of No Labels, Senator Joe Lieberman, tragically passed away just a few weeks ago. Did that impact the decision here to put an end to the unity ticket?
It didn't. Look, it was a huge loss for all of us. They really don't make leaders like Senator Lieberman anymore. He really embodied for us this country over party ethic of leadership that we think is sorely missing in the country. Obviously, it's a big loss for all of us, personally and professionally. Aside from being, a great man, he was just a really good man, just a really decent person. So we all miss him. But that didn't really affect our decision one way or the other in terms of whether we went forward with the ticket. That was really driven by what we always said it was going to be driven by, which is the data in the opening, and whether or not we could find a ticket that we thought could actually win.
And now looking ahead, does No Labels support anyone in the general election?
So we're still working through what kind of posture we're going to have in the general election. We haven't decided yet whether, in fact, we want to get behind one of the major party nominees. I would say I think it's unlikely. And I'll tell you here's why, is because the credibility that No Labels has had over the course of these last 14 years is not being as a partisan actor. The most important thing we've been able to do is really try to be a facilitator, to try to bring people from both sides together. And so that's why I mentioned earlier, we're really going to redouble our focus on the work we've done in the House. We were the force that created this bipartisan House Problem Solvers Caucus. We've got a group of Senate allies that we work very closely with. And I think our instinct right now is that the most important role we can play is after we get done with this tremendously divisive election, where, frankly, you're going to have elements on both sides who effectively want to start a resistance. Like whether it's Biden that wins or Trump that wins, there will be a meaningful chunk of both parties that will look at these people as the Antichrist and kind of try to send a signal that you're not even allowed to work with these people, with this president. And we just can't afford that as a country. We have too many serious problems to solve. And so No Labels is going to be doing a lot to, we think, pick up the pieces after the election. And then before the election, we're going to be doing a lot of work on the policy front to make sure that the interests of what we call this common sense majority are actually listened to. So we're going to be out there a lot advocating for issues we know that our community cares about, that a unity ticket would have run on if there had been a unity ticket.
What does picking up the pieces post-election look like? Because you noted earlier, half of the country is going to wake up the day after the election feeling disappointed, feeling like, not to be dramatic, but hey, this country might not be able to go on one way or another. So how do you pick up those pieces when there wasn't enough support for that unity ticket to go forward in the beginning?
Because even there is plenty of support for the unity ticket as a concept. Like I said, what we weren't able to find was the two candidates that we thought could actually blaze a path to victory, and we never wanted to be a spoiler, so that's why we didn't put up a ticket. But there is absolutely an appetite for this kind of approach, for this common sense bipartisan problem solving, and beyond that, there is a revulsion towards this rank partisanship and anger and hatred and divisiveness that is eating the country apart. The reality is, when this election is over, we are still going to have to fix our immigration system. We are still going to have to do something about our budget. We're still going to have to deal with inflation and energy and climate change and countless other issues. And that only gets done, in most cases, if you have some element of bipartisanship. The simple math of it. I mean, look, if you look at the projections today, the projections are the Republicans will probably take the Senate, and that the Democrats will probably take back the House. Now, lots can change, but let's assume that happens. That means it is an issue of simple math that you will either have bipartisanship or you will have total gridlock. And that's just a reality that we're all going to have to deal with after this election.
When you look at No Labels as this facilitator, as this problem-solving force, who are you getting more support from? Disenfranchised Republicans or disenfranchised Democrats?
I mean, it's really all across the spectrum. It's disenfranchised Republicans and it's disenfranchised Democrats. Of course, it's increasingly people who now identify as independents. One of the biggest changes we've seen in the electorate over the course of the last couple decades is when Ross Perot ran for president in 1992, Gallup would ask people, how do you identify as Democrat, Republican, or independent? It was about a third, a third, a third. Today, it is almost 50% of people who identify as independents, which just shows increasingly how they don't see either party meeting their needs or advancing their priorities.
I know No Labels just announced last week that they're no longer putting forth this unity ticket, but what do you think the future is for this organization?
Well, look, it's just been a week since we shut down our presidential effort. So what we're doing is we're doing a lot of strategic planning, frankly, at this point, which is we had this big effort. We decided to shut it down for all the reasons we described. We didn't want to be a spoiler. But what we did over the course of this effort is we significantly expanded this movement. I mean, over 1 million people signed petition in their states to get No Labels on the ballot. A lot more people know what No Labels is and what it stands for. There's a lot of people who have seen themselves as politically homeless, and now they see a home with No Labels. So what we're going to try to do is figure out, how do we take these assets that we built over the last 2 years and really apply them to creating some more constructive change. We're still working through exactly how we're going to do that, but I think it is very fair to say we're going to be very active in supporting common sense problem solvers in the House, in the Senate, because that's what we did for a big chunk of the last decade before we started this ballot access effort.
And I know, like you said, we're still looking at the 2024 election, but I want to look even a little further. And do you see No Labels putting forth a unity ticket for 2028?
I mean, look, it really is too early to say, and I know that's a little bit of a cop-out. But I will say this, a lot of it does depend on what the parties decide to do. Like, they still are not getting the message. In a lot of ways, when you look at the ways the parties communicate, they increasingly just narrowcast to their base. And the people who run the campaigns for Democrats and Republicans, they just say, look, we're running base turnout elections. They don't even bother talking to the independents. If that continues over time, what you are going to see is more and more people who will just be leaving the parties. So instead of having, 45% of people who are independents now, maybe that gets over 50 in the years ahead. I mean, look, one of the things that is really notable is if you look at the demographics in people's affiliation with parties, every single generation that you get as you get younger, they have less and less connection to the party. So if you have people who are over 65, a lot of them still have an affinity for Democrats, Republicans. You look at people under 25 years old, over half of them are independents. And so if our political system continues to ignore what people want, I think it's just inevitable there's going to be more and more of an opening for this kind of politics, and that could always include, another independent presidential win.
It's really no secret that this is a extremely divisive time politically. So what do you see then as the future of both of these parties?
Well, I mean, look, I think the future of both these parties is going to be, they're going to go away if they don't adapt to changing times. And I know that seems impossible. We've had a very static system for really like 150 years since the Civil War. But look, the way democracies work is pretty simple. You get these parties and they come together, and if they meet the needs of a big enough chunk of people, then they can get power and they can govern. But if they don't do that over time, either they lose power or they go away. And I think the thing that when you look at both parties, look, you look at the Republican side, frankly, it has just kind of become a vehicle for Donald Trump's personal ambitions. And whether or not you have a position in the party really is dictated by your loyalty to Donald Trump or not. You look at the Democratic side and you see a party, and I came up in Democratic politics, you see a party that in a lot of ways is moving to the left and away from the center. So you see a party that used to be about equality of opportunity, and now it's about equity of outcomes. You see a party that used to be about giving people a hand up, and it's increasingly about giving handouts. And this is just not where most people are. It's not what they want from their government. And if the parties continue to be this unresponsive to what the public wants, there's going to be more competition over time.
Brian Clancy, I appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.